Do you think every family has a villain, or is it more complicated?
They said they had no extra money for medical stuff, and the way my mom said it sounded so final, like the decision had been made long before I even opened my mouth, and it wasn't about budgets or bills or some emergency fund. It was about priorities. And clearly, I wasn't one of them. I had sat at that kitchen table, explaining with every ounce of calm I had left that this procedure wasn't optional. It wasn't about vanity or comfort. It was about my health, about fixing something that had been hurting me for years. I wasn't asking them to hand me a stack of cash out of nowhere. I told them I'd cover what I could, that I had already saved up a chunk but was short. And they looked at me like I was asking for something absurd, like a brand new sports car or some designer purse, not a medical treatment. Dad muttered that times were tough, costs were rising, they were just trying to keep the house running, and Mom repeated that tired line, no extra money for medical stuff, as if saying it twice made it the truth. I sat there, stunned, because for as long as I could remember they had preached family, family first, family always takes care of each other, and yet here I was, not asking for luxuries, not even asking for much. Just a hand up in a situation that directly affected my well-being, and they made it sound like I was selfish for even daring to bring it up. My brother, of course, didn't say a word. He leaned back in his chair, smirking a little like the whole thing was beneath him, like watching me ask for help was some kind of entertainment. He didn't offer to chip in, didn't even ask what it cost. He just tapped on his phone, chuckling at something, and the sound of his laugh burned into me because it made the whole situation worse. I tried to reason with them, telling them that I wasn't going to be able to keep working as I was if I didn't get this taken care of, that I wasn't exaggerating when I said the pain was becoming unbearable. But my words fell flat. Dad told me to stop dramatizing, said I'd always been the one to make everything sound bigger than it was. And Mom, instead of looking at me, looked at the sink, fiddling with some dishes, as if the clinking of plates mattered more than the conversation. That was the part that stung the most, the avoidance, the quiet dismissal, the message hidden between every word. We don't see you, we don't take you seriously, and we're not going to start now. So I stopped pushing. I swallowed the lump in my throat, nodded, and told them I understood, even though inside I wanted to scream. What I understood wasn't that money was tight, because I knew it wasn't. What I understood was that their loyalty had limits, and apparently my medical needs didn't make the cut. They had money for family dinners, money for little getaways, money for renovations on the house. They had money when my brother wanted something, always did. I wasn't blind. But for me, the line was, we don't have extra. That night, I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel harder than I realized, thinking about how many times I had convinced myself they would show up when it mattered. I had always defended them when friends hinted that my parents played favorites, always shrugged it off when it was clear my brother got the better deal, told myself I was overthinking. But now the evidence was right there, undeniable, in the cold tone of my father's voice and the rehearsed dismissal in my mother's eyes. For a while, I tried to make peace with it. I told myself families aren't perfect, that maybe they really couldn't spare it, maybe I should just accept it and move on. But there's only so much self-delusion you can live with before the cracks start showing. And when the cracks showed, they split wide open in a way I never could have predicted, because just a few weeks later, when I had managed to distract myself from the sting of their refusal, I opened social media one morning and saw something that nearly knocked the air out of me. My brother, standing in front of a massive vacation villa, smiling ear to ear, while my parents beamed next to him, and right across the balcony hung a huge red bow. Like this was some fairy tale surprise gift. I stared at that picture, at the caption full of hearts and congratulations, at the comments from friends and extended family calling him blessed and lucky, and all I could think was, so this is what no extra money looks like. The photo looked like one of those glossy ads people scroll past without thinking, except the faces were familiar, and the caption was a paragraph of gratitude that sounded like it had been drafted by a real estate agent and a pastor at the same time. Full of talk about hard work and blessings and family dreams coming true, and right there in the middle of all that shine was my brother with his arms flung wide while my parents stood close, smiling the kind of smile people practice when they want the whole town to know they are doing just fine, and the bow hanging across the balcony made the whole thing feel like a punchline to a joke I had not agreed to be part of. I stared at it long enough for the phone screen to dim, and when it lit again I went through the comments, because of course there were many cousins and neighbors and people from church writing about how generous my parents were and how proud they must be. And every line of praise rubbed the inside of my chest raw because only a handful of days earlier I had sat at that kitchen table listening to a lecture about responsibility and priorities, while they told me there was no extra money for medical stuff. I did not call them, and I did not write a long message, because I had already learned that when people decide to misunderstand you, they will put in the hours. They will bend reality until it fits whatever story keeps them comfortable. And I was tired of playing defense in a house where the scoreboard was always rigged, so I did something that was small on the surface and massive in effect, something that did not require a raised voice or a scene, just a surgical cut through the image they were selling, and I left one single comment under the photo that said, in the most even tone I could manage, that I was glad the money situation had improved since last month when I was told there was nothing to spare for a necessary medical procedure, that I wished them many peaceful weekends at the villa, and that I had handled the care on my own like the grown woman I apparently needed to be. I hit post and put the phone face down and made myself a cup of coffee I did not even want, and by the time the cup was half empty, my phone was lighting like a slot machine because people had questions, and people always have questions when the script gets interrupted. The first call was my brother, who went straight to shouting about jealousy and drama and how I had ruined a happy day, which told me everything I needed to know about how he planned to live in that house. Because anyone who starts with shouting is someone who thinks volume is evidence, and I let him talk until he ran out of eager words, and then told him that I had not written anything untrue, that I had simply wished them well and provided a line of context that a lot of people apparently missed. And when he called me manipulative, I said that if a fact feels manipulative, it is probably because the surrounding story is a lie, and then I ended the call because I refused to audition for a role I do not want. The next call was my mother, who tried to coax me into deleting the comment for the sake of appearances, and I listened to the soft tremble in her voice and thought about how appearances had always been the main family tradition. And I told her that if she wanted the comment gone, she could replace it with an honest apology that acknowledged the difference between health and luxury. And then I told her I was busy, and I really was, because I had appointments to move and emails to send and a very quiet plan to shape. By the afternoon, I had messages from relatives who had never once checked on me, suddenly eager to understand what procedure I needed and whether I was exaggerating. And I answered only the ones who had earned the right to ask by showing up when there was nothing shiny to gain, and to them I said I was fine, that I had found a way, and that I was done explaining myself in a family that treated me like a line item to be cut when the optics were inconvenient. That night there was a group chat explosion with paragraphs about forgiveness and unity, and how we should not air private matters, and I wrote one final note that said privacy is not the same as secrecy. That refusing help while buying a victory banner is not a private matter, but a public decision, and that I would not be attending the housewarming because the theme clashed with my medical record. Then I left the chat, turned off notifications, and felt the strangest kind of relief. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but the calm that shows up when you stop arguing with math. My little act was not revenge the way people expect it, with fireworks and broken plates and slamming doors, but it did exactly what I needed, which was to pierce the pretty balloon they had floated above themselves, to let enough air out that they would hear the squeal every time they tried to call it a blessing without mentioning the cost. And within a day my father was texting me that I had embarrassed the family, and my brother was posting new photos about paying his own way, which made me laugh, because he never used to bother with narratives when there were gifts to unwrap. I did not delete my comment, I did not explain it, and I did not argue about it, because the point had never been to win a debate. It had been to quietly mark the line they had crossed, and to remind them that if they were going to build a story out of me, they would have to live with the footnotes, and it was in that calm that the next piece of my plan slipped into place. Because while they were busy scrambling for a cleaner caption, I was filing a change of emergency contact, clearing the last threads that tied my day to their calendar, and scheduling a meeting that would set the rest of my life on a track they no longer controlled. And when the confirmation email landed in my inbox, I knew the real move was finally ready. I just needed one more quiet afternoon to pull the pin. The morning after the comment storm, I did something that felt small and boring and exactly right, because instead of arguing in circles with people who love the sound of their own rationalizations, I opened my laptop, pulled up every form, portal, and account where my name had been sitting in the background like a free convenience for the family, and I started changing things, not out of spite, but out of self-respect, removing my parents from medical releases so no one could call pretending to advocate for me while actually policing my choices, updating beneficiaries so my life would not default to people who treated me like a budget problem, switching emergency contacts to a friend who had shown up for me when nothing about my situation was glamorous, and while I was in that practical rhythm, I called the bank and closed the old card I had opened years ago to help my mother when she was between jobs, the one that had quietly become their safety net for holiday decorations and last-minute flights and whatever else felt urgent. When the bill landed in my inbox with my name at the top and their fingerprints all over the charges, and when the clerk asked why I was closing it, I said I had outgrown being useful and left it at that. It is funny how silence can be louder than shouting when you do it right, because I did not make a public speech about boundaries or hold a family summit. I just stopped attending the weekly dinners where I was expected to bring dessert and also gratitude. I stopped answering calls that began with a sigh and ended with a lecture, and I started replacing the hours I had spent taming other people's moods with work that paid me and rest that healed me, and in that quiet space my world shifted in a way that was not dramatic to look at but was so real I could feel it in how I breathed. Because I booked the procedure with a payment plan I negotiated myself, I took the time off that I had been scared to take. And I let the recovery be slow and unglamorous without apologizing for it, and when my energy came back it did not ask my parents for permission to exist, it just showed up and filled the room. I said yes to extra projects I would have turned down out of guilt before. I took a short certification that made clients stop treating me like a favor and start treating me like a solution. I moved my savings into an account that only I could see. And I started tracking my days with a kind of curiosity I had never allowed myself, asking which choices made me feel steady and which ones made me feel like I was auditioning for a part in a family play that had terrible reviews. And every time my brother tried to bait me with a text about how I must be miserable without the warmth of the group, I would put the phone down and answer an email from someone who wanted to pay me for something I was good at, and little by little the scales reset. Not because I fought harder, but because I stopped volunteering for a fight that could never be won. They called me dramatic, of course they did, because when you stop handing over access, the people who benefited most from it will call you names as if that entitles them to a refund. And my mother tried the soft approach about how families go through seasons and I should not hold on to things, and my father tried the practical approach about how credit histories are complicated and I should consider reopening the card for the sake of points. And my brother tried the cruel approach with a video tour of the villa where he narrated square footage like he was a game show host, and I let all of it roll past me because none of it had anything to do with me anymore. Not the performance, not the bait, not the redesigned guest room that he said had my name on it like that was supposed to erase the fact that when I needed help they chose a ribbon over a life. If there was a moment that felt like revenge, it was not when a purchase got declined at a home store because the card no longer existed, though the timing made me smile. And it was not when the group chat sputtered to life with confusion about why the homeowner insurance letter had been returned, because I had also removed my address from everything they used as a convenient mailbox. It was when I received a calm email from the hospital financial office confirming that my account was settled, that my plan had been honored, and that no third party would be contacted for collections, because buried in that dry language was the truth I had been building toward, that I could take care of myself without clearing it with people who had confused parenthood with public relations. And I printed that email and tucked it into a folder with my new contracts and my new lease and the paperwork for the small investment account I had opened after my recovery, a quiet archive of decisions no one could rewrite. And because life loves symmetry, I found myself, a few months into this new rhythm, sitting in a lobby for a meeting I had booked with a client who needed help untangling a mess with a homeowner association that had overpromised amenities and underdelivered maintenance. Listening to the manager explain how special assessments work when a community's budgets are built on excitement instead of math, taking notes on timelines and fines, and how quickly pride turns to panic when the first letters go out, and when he mentioned a new development with a flashy ribbon cutting that had already blown through its reserves. I looked down at the address on the sample notice. He slid across the table and felt every hair on my arms rise, because I knew that street name. I knew that builder, and I knew exactly which balcony had been wrapped in a giant red bow, so I closed my notebook, thanked him for his time, and thought to myself that for once I did not need to plan a thing. I just needed to wait for the mail to do it for me. The first envelope did not come to me, which was the whole point of stepping back and letting cause have its effect without me narrating it. Because when the Homeowners Association finally sent their special assessment letter with the kind of tight deadline and stern language that only shows up after months of sloppy optimism, it landed in my parents' mailbox with my brother's name in bold and a number that looked like a dare, and within an hour my phone lit up with a call I did not answer, followed by a voice message that started with fake calm and slid straight into panic, and I listened to him talk about unexpected fees and greedy boards, and how no one had told him that reserves were real and roofs did not care about positive thinking. And I sat there with my coffee going lukewarm, remembering the sentence about no extra money for medical stuff, and told myself to keep breathing and let the math show everyone a lesson I had paid for impatience. By the time my mother called, the tone had shifted from panic to negotiation, because she launched into a speech about how families handle surprises together and how this was just a bump in the road. And while she carefully avoided every word that might sound like an apology, she circled the ask in spirals, hinting at temporary help and joint solutions and how elegant it would look if I dropped by the bank and co-signed a small line of credit. And I let her talk until she ran out of euphemisms, and then said, in the same steady voice I had practiced for months, that I did not co-sign for people who had taught me that health is optional while square footage is sacred, that I hoped they could negotiate a plan like adults, and that I had found information that might actually help, which I then emailed to her without commentary. A neat packet with a plain summary of the state statutes on reserve studies and special assessments. A template for a hardship request that any owner could submit, without theatrics, and a short list of legal clinics that could advise for free, because if we were going to play grown-up games, then everyone could have grown-up tools, and if she heard the click of a door closing in that neat email, that was not my problem anymore. What I did not tell her was that 2 days earlier, when I had recognized the development from that meeting, I had reached out to the manager I knew and offered a few hours of paid consulting to help them revise their communication. Not because I wanted to hurt my family, but because sloppy messaging is how boards breed chaos and exceptions, and I built systems for a living now, so I helped them tighten the language in their notices, add a clear schedule for late fees, and set up a portal that recorded every call and promise in writing, because what burned me most in our house was how words shapeshift when no one is taking notes, and if there was a small thrill in knowing that my brother would encounter a process that did not budge for charm, I allowed myself that private victory, since fairness often looks like revenge to people who are used to being the exception. While all of that moved forward on its own rails, I lived my life in a way that would have sounded like bragging to the girl I used to be, because my work had turned into something solid and respected. My health was no longer a bargaining chip. And I had built a steady chain of clients who paid on time because I delivered on time, and even though I did not post milestone photos or hunger for applause, the news still traveled, and soon enough my father called with a new tone I had never heard before, the sound of a man who has realized the ground is no longer his, asking if we could sit down like adults and talk about the future. Which was hilarious considering that the future had been the one thing they refused to imagine with me in it when it would have required them to say yes to something that did not have a ribbon on it. I agreed to meet, because I have learned that sometimes the most generous thing you can do for yourself is to let people speak until their story collapses under its own weight, so I chose a neutral place with good chairs and no music. I put a clean folder in my bag with 3 simple items that mattered more than any speech I could deliver, and I wrote down 2 rules on a sticky note for myself so I would not get pulled into the old choreography. The first, that I would not argue about facts that lived on paper, and the second that I would not negotiate with people who treated my pain like a budget line, and I closed the bag and went to sleep with a calm that came from knowing that my plan did not require them to be different, because all it required was for me to keep being the woman I had become while they were busy polishing the villa. And because I believe in a little poetic symmetry even when I refuse to live as a poem, I delivered one last small act that felt like justice without cruelty, which was to forward, from a fresh professional email address that had no family fingerprints on it, the registration link for a short community webinar I was hosting about understanding reserve studies and avoiding special assessments. A simple workshop built from my work that happened to use a case study from a new coastal development that had wrapped a balcony in a very loud bow, which sold out in an afternoon and quietly flooded the board with smart questions. And while my brother scrambled to put the villa on short-term rental platforms and my parents rehearsed the speech they planned to give me at our meeting, I printed the receipt for the webinar donations that were being directed to a patient assistance fund at the very hospital that treated me, tucked it in the folder behind the statutes and the hardship template, and thought to myself that I was finally ready to show them the price of a bow, not in shouting or shame, but in the currency they had always undervalued, which is a woman's resolve backed by paper, policy, and a memory that does not need their permission to be true. When we finally sat down across from each other in that bland little cafe that I had chosen precisely because it carried no nostalgia, no soft corners of memory to trick me into sentimentality, the air between us was heavy with a silence that none of them quite knew how to manage, because for once it was not me filling the space with explanations or apologies, it was them shifting in their seats, looking older than I remembered, waiting for me to rescue the conversation the way I always had before, and I let the pause stretch long enough for the waitress to refill the water glasses twice before my father finally leaned forward with that clipped, managerial tone that had so often been mistaken for authority and started explaining how the villa was more complicated than expected, how expenses had appeared from nowhere, how the homeowners association was unreasonable, how they had been blindsided by assessments that were unfair, and how this was all putting a terrible strain on them, financially and emotionally, as if the weight of their story might pin me back into the role I had once played, the dutiful daughter whose loyalty could be counted on like a line of credit. I listened without interrupting, which confused him more than any rebuttal could have, because when a man is used to controlling the script, silence is the most dangerous reply, and when he finally ran out of jargon, my mother jumped in with her softer voice, talking about family unity and how these are the times when people are supposed to step up for one another, making sure to stress that I had always been the reliable one, the one with common sense, the one who could be counted on to hold everything together, as if flattery might erase the sentence about no extra money for medical stuff, as if reminding me of my better qualities would cancel out the months of quiet exile they had forced me into, and as she spoke I looked at her hands, twisting the napkin in nervous spirals, and realized that for the first time in my life I did not feel the urge to reach across the table and comfort her, because the guilt she was trying to pass on did not belong to me anymore. Then came my brother, who could never resist the spotlight, who leaned back with his smirk and his practiced charm, and started talking about opportunities, about how the villa could be a brilliant investment if handled properly, how with the right support it could turn from a liability into a family legacy, how I could step in, not as a handout, but as a partner, and share in the glory when it all turned around, and the arrogance of it was almost funny, because he had not even noticed that the only reason he had been able to pose in front of that bow in the first place was because my parents had thrown everything at him that they had refused me, and now he wanted to offer me a piece of the sinking ship as if it were a crown jewel. I let him talk until he had painted his little fantasy, until he believed he had pulled me into his orbit again, and then I leaned forward, folded my hands, and said clearly, slowly, without raising my voice, that I was not interested in a partnership, that I did not want the villa, the burden, or the legacy, that I had built something of my own that did not require their permission, their money, or their drama, and that I was only here today because I wanted to look them in the eye when I made it plain that I had moved on, not in anger but in clarity. The folder slid from my bag onto the table with a quiet thud, and when I opened it, I did not hand them the statutes or the hardship templates or even the donation receipt. I simply showed them the document from my hospital account with the bold words, "Paid in full," and I said that while they had been busy tying bows around balconies, I had taken care of my own health, my own bills, and my own life, and that the part of me that once begged them to see me had been retired permanently. I did not need their help, and I did not seek their approval. My father's face tightened, my mother's eyes filled, and my brother muttered something about me being ungrateful, but none of it touched me, because the moment I set that paper on the table, I knew that I had already won, not by humiliating them, not by shouting or demanding repayment, but by proving that the very thing they had denied me had become the foundation of my independence. I stood up before they could regroup, leaving the folder behind like a mirror they would have to look into whether they liked it or not, and I walked out of that cafe without glancing back. Not because I wanted to be dramatic, but because the power of the moment was in the clean break, the refusal to linger, the final act of choosing myself over the endless cycle of their excuses. And as I stepped onto the street, breathing air that felt sharper and lighter than anything I had tasted in years, I realized that the revenge had never been about making them suffer. It had been about freeing myself from the grip of people who had measured love in ribbons and applause, and showing them that the daughter they thought they could shrink had quietly become the woman who no longer needed their table, their validation, or their villa. And that was the end, not of family, not of history, but of the part of my life where I mistook scraps for love, because now they could sit with their choices, and I could walk forward with mine, and no matter how they tried to retell it later, we would all know the truth. They gave away their loyalty for the price of a bow, and I built a life they could not touch.